Welcome to Lecture 2 of the Catholic Courses series on Shakespeare's Catholicism. The title of this lecture is Revealing the Catholic Shakespeare, the Biographical Evidence. In the first lecture, of course, we looked at why Shakespeare's Catholicism, why Shakespeare's personal beliefs are important to understand the plays, and we also gave the evidence for the fact that only Shakespeare could have written Shakespeare's plays and no one else has written them. But as regards Shakespeare's own Catholic faith, is Shakespeare a Catholic? Is there enough evidence to show what Shakespeare's religious beliefs were? Well, the first thing I want to say is that I am myself a convert to the Catholic Shakespeare, as it were. When I first arrived in the United States 10 years ago, I was very skeptical. I was a skeptic where this question is concerned. And I had a colleague at Ave Maria who used to claim that Shakespeare was a Catholic. My position was that the only honest position is to be an agnostic, to admit that we don't know. We don't know who Shakespeare was. We don't have enough evidence from his life. We just have to be honest about our ignorance. However, what began to happen, and I liken it to a jigsaw puzzle. My argument was, here we have, should we say, 100-piece jigsaw puzzle. My argument was, well, we know so little about Shakespeare's life, it's like having maybe 4 pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, and all the rest of them are missing. And if you've only got 4 pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, you can't possibly know what the picture is. We just don't know enough about Shakespeare. But then what happens through my reading, research, discussions, I kept finding other pieces of the picture. And you get to a position in the end, maybe you've got 12 or 15 pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. And at that point you think, hang on for a second, perhaps there is something in this theory that Shakespeare was a Catholic. Perhaps there is evidence. There seems to be much more evidence than I thought. And it was then that I began my own systematic research into the subject. And when I started researching the subject, it was as if loads of other pieces of the jigsaw puzzle were just there out of sight, and we make some effort to find them, and there they are. So one piece after another piece after another piece of Shakespeare's Catholicism entered the puzzle. So I would say the situation is today that we have, should we say, 50 of the 100 pieces. Now, if you have 50 pieces of jigsaw puzzle, you don't have all the pieces, but you have enough pieces to form a picture. You know exactly what that is. If you had 50 pieces of a portrait of Shakespeare, you know it was a portrait of Shakespeare. So what we have are enough facts on Shakespeare's life to have a portrait of Shakespeare as a believing Catholic. So what are these pieces? I converted to Shakespeare's Catholicism through the solid, documentary and biographical evidence for his faith. I would add also, of course, there's all sorts of clear Catholic symbolism and sympathy in Shakespeare's plays, the textual evidence for his Catholicism, and that's what we'll be looking at in the next 6 lectures. But in this one, I'm going to concentrate purely on the biographical, factual, documentary evidence from Shakespeare's life. So what do we know? Well, Shakespeare's mother, Mary Arden, came from one of the most notorious recusant families in the whole of England. At this point, perhaps we should define what we mean by recusant. What is recusant? In England, in Queen Elizabeth's time, in the late 16th century, historians have shown that the majority of English people were still sympathetic to Catholicism. We should make one thing perfectly clear here, historically. The English Reformation is not the same thing as the Reformation that happened on the continent. On the continent, the Reformation was about ideas. It was about theology. Martin Luther had some ideas about theology. John Calvin had some ideas about theology that conflicted with each other and also with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, of course, also has its own ideas on theology. And this clash between opposing theological perspectives led to the Reformation. In England, however, what happened was that King Henry VIII wanted a divorce from his wife, Catherine of Aragon, a good, pious Catholic woman. And she did not want to give Henry VIII a divorce. The Holy Father, the Pope, refused to grant the divorce. So Henry VIII, in a peak of arrogance and pride, declares himself the head of the Church in England. And the Anglican Church is born. At the time, unlike in parts of Europe, such as Switzerland and parts of France and Germany, there was no appetite for Protestantism. The English were very comfortable and happy in their Catholic faith. There would have been no Reformation in England based upon theology. The religious houses in England were amongst the healthiest in the whole of Christendom. Historians have shown there was relatively little corruption. It was a place where they looked after the poor, the sick. So the church was healthy in England. Catholicism was healthy in England. There was no desire to have any change. And what happens is a Machiavellian, draconian tyrant, Henry VIII, imposes his political will on the people against their will and forces upon them a religion they do not want. So there's a resentment to this. We could talk about that more, and I think part of the growth of cynicism towards religion in England in the following century is a result of having a religion forced upon them they didn't want. But in Shakespeare's time, the majority of English people were still Catholic. Now, but they were Catholic in three different ways. And you could say that to be a Catholic in England, which is probably most of the population, put you in one of three camps. The first were what we might call the church conformists. Now, these Catholics went to the Anglican services because to not go to the Anglican services meant you were fined. So they, rather than be fined, they outwardly conformed, but secretly wished and hoped for the return of the good old days when the Catholic Church would be reinstated. But other than that, they did nothing about it. The second group were what are known as the Church Papists. These were the Catholics that went to the Anglican Church to avoid paying the fines, but secretly also went to Catholic Mass when there was a priest in the neighbourhood, went to confession. So they lived a double life, practicing the Catholic faith illegally while outwardly conforming to the Anglican Church, the Church Papists. The third group were the recusants. The recusants were the devout, the defiant, the militant Catholics who refused to attend Anglican Church and paid the fines. The fines, by the way, were huge. They were enormous, the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars, not anything paltry. Shakespeare's family were recusants. Shakespeare's mother's family, the Ardens, were one of the most notorious recusant families in the whole of England. Several of Shakespeare's cousins were executed for their role in political popery, as it was called, political Catholicism.